Now let's look at odd and even roots. Every number has just one real root when n is odd. What we talked about previously with cube roots falls under that description. Odd roots of positive numbers are positive and odd roots of negative numbers are negative. This is very important to remember. Absolute value signs are not used when finding odd roots. When the index n is even, we say that we are taking an even root. Every positive real number has two real nth roots when n is even, one positive and one negative. Negative numbers do not have real nth roots when n is even. This is when you get complex numbers. When n is even, the notation nth root of a indicates the non-negative nth root. To write even nth roots, absolute value signs are often necessary. Let's simplify some odd and even root expressions if possible. Assume that variables can represent any real number. So if it says any real number, that means that if it's an even root, could be positive and negative. If we look at the index on the first example, we have 5 as the index. So we would read this as the fifth root of 32. Since this is an odd index, 32 will have a positive output. So 32, if we think about how this factors, we would have 2 and 16, and 4 and 4. 4 factors to 2 and 2. So this is 2 raised to the 5th. So let's rewrite this as the 5th root of 2 to the 5th. This is equal to 2. Now let's look at B. We have the 5th root of negative 32. Well, we know that 2 to the 5th is 32, so negative 2 raised to the 5th must certainly be negative 32. In which case, our solution for the 5th root of negative 32 would just be negative 2. And lastly, we have C here, negative 5th root of 32. This negative sign is outside of the calculation. Notice how it's sitting on the outside of the radical. We could even put that in its own little multiplication. I'll change the color so you can see that the 5th root of 32 is multiplied to the negative 1. So when I simplify this, I'll have negative 1 times positive 2, which is negative 2. Now let's look at D. We have the 4th root of 16. Now, it's an even root, which means we'll get a plus or minus sign. And we want to find out what number multiplied to itself 4 times would give us 16. Well, 2 to the 4th is equal to 16. So we have the 4th root of 2 raised to the 4th. And don't forget the plus or minus. So we have plus or minus 2 as our simplified expression. The 4th root of 81, x to the 4th, would be plus or minus because of the even root. And then 81, if we factor that, using a factoring tree, we would get 9 and 9. 9 factors to 3 and 3. So 3 to the 4th is 9. So I'm going to just rewrite this. We're going to have the 4th root of 3 raised to the 4th, x raised to the 4th. And so I'll have plus or minus 3x as my simplified expression. Let's look at the 4th root of negative 16. This is similar to d directly above it. This will give us 4th root of negative 2 in parentheses raised to the 4th. If we were to multiply negative 2 to itself 4 times, we would get positive 16. So this can't be an option. Because it's an even root, we also know that we'll have plus or minus. There'll be plus or minus expressions as possible simplified expressions. So I will rewrite this as 4 4th root of negative 1 times 2 to the 4th. Now, just double check. If I raise 2 to the 4th, that will give me 16. If I multiply it by negative 1, I'll get the negative 16 that I had just above it. But then, remember, an even root of a negative number is I. So we're going to have 2i, and don't forget that plus or minus out front. F is negative the 4th root of 16. The negative is outside the radical. So we can think of it as a separate operation from the 4th root of 16. Remember, 16 is 2 to the 4th, and so we'll have negative 1 times plus or minus 2. Now, if I have a negative times a positive, that will give me a negative 2. If I have a negative times a negative, that will give me a positive 2. So if I simplify this down, I will still have plus or minus 2. Let's look at this last one. It's the 6th root of y plus 5 raised to the 6th. It's an even root. Or even radical. So we'll have plus or minus. The index and the exponent match. And so our answer or simplification of this expression will be plus or minus y plus 5.